Hey everybody, today we're going to read this story. It's called The Honeymakers. So we're going to continue reading about bees. And this story is written and illustrated by Gail Gibbons. We also read a story by her that was about chickens. It is springtime. Two beekeepers have placed a beehive on a hill. Activity begins around the hive. The honeybees and the beekeepers are honeybees travel to and from the hive. Their earliest ancestors lived about 80 million years ago. The scientific name for honeybee comes from the Latin words Apis mellifera, meaning honey bearer. Honeybees are social creatures. So remember we read that social creatures means they like to have friends. They form highly structured groups called colonies. In a colony, as many as 50,000 or more bees live together and work at their own special jobs. Many honeybees like to make their homes in dark, enclosed places. Often, a colony of wild honeybees builds its hive in a hollow tree. Honeybees cared for by today's beekeepers live in box-shaped wood hives. So this one is one that you would see from a beekeeper, somebody that's raising bees at their house. And this is a wild one. So up in a tree, you can see if it's hollow, that means there's nothing on the inside. So you can see where it's black, that would be where it's hollow. Inside the beehive, the honeybees are building an amazing structure called a honeycomb. It is made up of countless six-sided cells. Who knows what a six-sided shape is called? Hopefully everybody. A hexagon. Stored in many of these wax cells is the food that bees and people love to eat. Honey. 3 different kinds of honeybees live inside all beehives. There is one queen, about 100 male drones, and thousands of female worker bees. Like all insects, bees have 3 body parts. There's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Honeybees have other parts too. So they have their antenna, they've got large forewings, and then they have small hind wings, and they have that stinger. The queen is the largest of the honeybees. You can see here she is. She's much bigger. And she can live the longest, from 3 to 5 years. All the other bees in the colony live for about 2 months, except over winter, when they live a few months longer. It is the queen's job to make sure the hive never runs out of bees. To do this, she leaves the hive to mate with her drones. Then she lays as many as 2,000 eggs a day. Drones are usually smaller than the queen. Their only job is to mate with her. Most cells in the beehive are used for storing honey, but some are used for the queen to lay her eggs. These are called brood cells. In each brood cell, a bee will develop and grow. The largest brood cells are queen brood cells, also called royal cells. Drone brood cells are smaller. Even smaller are the worker brood cells. The eggs in those cells would become worker bees. Although all worker bees are female, they do not lay eggs. Instead, they do the work of the beehive. So if you look at these cells, the queens laid the little bitty eggs inside each cell. And so, let's see what happens. Most eggs the queen lays are no bigger than the period at the end of this sentence. So they're that tiny. After 3 days, a larva hatches from each one. So if you look, that larva is like the little worm. For the next 3 days, worker bees called nurse bees feed the larva bee milk. Then they feed it bee bread. A queen larva is fed royal jelly throughout its growth. Each larva grows quickly, then spins a silky cocoon around itself. Inside the cocoon, a pupa develops. A nurse bee seals the cell with wax. So there's the cocoon that larva created. Little by little, the pupa changes. It begins to look more like an adult insect. This process is called metamorphosis. Queens develop in about 16 days from the time the eggs are laid. The metamorphosis of drones and workers takes about 21 to 24 days. Finally, after the transformation is complete, an adult bee chews its way out of the brood cell as an adult honeybee. So it spun its cocoon, then it does its metamorphosis, so it starts to change, and finally it'll come out as an adult honeybee. The honeybee is a worker bee. From the minute she comes out of her brood cell, she is as busy as a bee. For the next 3 weeks, she will have a number of different jobs to do inside the hive. First, she is a house bee, cleaning and polishing the cells. About 3 days later, she becomes a nurse bee. So remember, the nurse bees take care of the babies. After 10 days of being a nurse bee, she becomes a wax-making bee. She makes flakes of wax in her abdomen and chews them to mold new cells or repair old ones. Wax-making bees are also in charge of storing the nectar and pollen that the other honeybees bring back to the hive. Other workers care for the queen. They are her court. They cluster around the queen to continually feed and groom her. So you can tell this one's the queen because she's the big one. And so those are the bees that help take care of her. About a week later, the wax-making bee becomes a guard bee and begins its outdoor life. Guard bees protect the hive. They chase away intruders with their stingers. So an intruder is somebody that's trying to come that's not invited. They also alert other bees by spreading a special scent when there is danger. A guard bee will sometimes die in battle to protect the hive and its honey. The worker bee is now about 3 weeks old. She is ready to become a forager bee. Her last job, but a very important one. Forager bees are the bees you see zipping from flower to flower. They collect sweet juices called nectar from the flowers for honey making. At each flower, the forager bee collects nectar with her proboscis. She stores the nectar in a special part of her body called the crop, or honey stomach. This stomach is separate from her other stomach. As she goes from flower to flower, she comes in contact with a yellow powder called pollen. Some of the pollen is collected in little baskets formed by the special hairs on her hind legs. So there she is on the flower, and you can see, if you look real close at the illustration, there's a pollen basket, and she's using her proboscis to get the nectar out of the flower. As the forager bee collects nectar, she carries pollen from flower to flower. This is part of a process called pollination. When she has visited many flowers and her crop is full, she beelines back to her hive. So when the pollen gets on the next flower, it helps that flower grow. Back inside the hive, the forager bee brings up or regurgitates the nectar. So she kind of throws it up. Then she transfers it by tongue to the hive bee. The nectar is passed by tongue among the hive bees until some of its moisture is gone. Then a wax-making bee places the nectar in a honey cell. There it continues to dry. So it's a lot of work. She has to pass it to them, and then they put it in the next cell. More and more nectar is added to the honey cell. House bees cluster over the cell and fan their wings to evaporate even more moisture. So they're going to fan their wings to make it really hot, so it becomes thicker and thicker. Finally, wax-making bees cap or seal the cell with wax. Slowly, the nectar ripens into honey. So when the bees collect it, it's not just honey. They have to make it. When forager bees return to their hive, they have a special way of telling the other forager bees of important discoveries, like a new location of flowers full of nectar and pollen. They do the dances of the bees. A forager honeybee can visit up to 10,000 flowers a day. All the nectar she collects in her entire life can make only about 1 teaspoon of honey. So a teaspoon is like a spoon that you eat off of. So she can only make 1 teaspoon. To make 1 pound of honey, it takes nectar from over 1 million flowers. Also, different kinds of honey comes from different kinds of flowers. So that's why it's really important that we keep planting and growing flowers to help the bees continue to make honey. Because it takes 1 million flowers to make 1 pound. Honeybees have always been valued for the honey they make. For thousands of years, people have stolen honey from wild beehives. People became beekeepers when they began to make their own hives. Some used hollow logs, others used clay pots. Later, in about 1500, European beekeepers started using upside-down basket hives called skeps. Then, in about 1850, the hanging movable frame beehive was invented. So they're talking about how this is what a wild beehive looks like, but people can raise them at their house. So it said it started as people used to use wooden logs, a pot to help the bees. This was called a skep. It kind of looks like a beehive. And then this was a hanging movable frame. On top of the hill is a modern beehive. So this is what they use today. The beehive is stacked in sections. So sections means it's stacked in little parts. In each section hang about 10 wooden frames where the bees build their honeycombs. To help the bees build their honeycomb faster, the beekeeper places wax foundations in the frame. So it says the foundation is a sheet of wax impressed on both sides with a pattern of honeycomb cells. So they put that in there to help the bees. It's time for the beekeepers to harvest the honey. The honeybees have had several months to build and fill the honeycombs. The colder the winter, the more food they will need. The beekeepers move slowly around the hive. They wear special clothes and use special equipment to protect themselves. What do you think they need to protect themselves from? What do bees have? Like, why do we not like bees, really? Because they can sting. So they have to wear those special helmet with a veil and those special clothes to keep themselves from getting stung a bunch. Back at home in a shed, the beekeeper uses a hot knife to cut the wax caps off the honeycomb. Then the honeycomb frame is placed inside an extractor. It spins around at a high speed to remove the honey without breaking the comb. The honey goes into a collecting tank. So they're using that hot knife to get all the honeycomb off. And then they said they put it in the extractor. Next, the honey is filtered through the screen and a cloth to remove small pieces of wax. Then the honey is placed in airtight jars. Sometimes beekeepers melt down old and damaged honeycombs to make beeswax, candles, and other things. The rest of the empty honeycomb frames are returned to the hive for the honeybees to fill again. For some beekeepers, honey making is a hobby. They use the hobby themselves or give the honey away as gifts. Commercial beekeepers provide honey for stores and shops with gleaming jars of their product to sell. Delicious sweet honey from the honeymakers. The end. So to get honey, it's a lot of work for those bees. They have to go from flower to flower to get all the nectar, and then they have to take it back to their hive. So bees have a lot of jobs. So if we want to keep our honey, if we want to keep having honey at our grocery stores and buying it from farmers markets, how is one way that we could help bees keep making honey? I want you to think about that for a second. There was something in there that it told us. We can plant flowers. Flowers help the bees. It said it took 1 million flowers. So we need lots of flowers. So if you can plant some flowers at your house, you could help the honeybees continue to make honey. All right. Have a great rest of your day.